Hola a todos, bienvenidos a Viajes FM y solo voy a dar una pequeña introducción para esta entrevista. Resultó ser un poco larga, tal vez de algunas 2 horas, entonces la dividí en partes. Esta va a ser la parte uno, pero al ser partes o al ser una misma entrevista cortada, no va a tener introducción ni conclusión, entonces nada más grabé una previa para explicar. Mi cámara falló, entonces solo van a ver mi foto de Zoom la mayoría del tiempo, pero la entrevista me gusta mucho. Se ve un poco general los temas y el propósito no es fingir que no hay más que decir, sino simplemente cubrir lo general y si les interesa, leer lo que escribió Jim. Entonces, sin más que agregar, comencemos.
So thank you, Brother Bennett, for being here today. And there are many people who watch the channel who might not be familiar with what you do. So could you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. My name is Jim Bennett. I've been a member of the church my whole life. I'm 54 years old. I live in Sandy, Utah. I have 5 children. And professionally, I work for a web startup called canonizer.com. In the church, my current calling is as a musical missionary. I sing in the Tabernáculo choir at Temple Square, which is one of the great joys of my life. And I understand that Gustavo, you saw us when we came down to Mexico City just a
Yeah,
couple of weeks ago.
it was
And
wonderful.
yeah, it was a lot of fun. The entire choir got sick, but it was still a delightful experience, and it was delightful to be with the saints. In terms of probably why you're talking to me, a few years back, I wrote a line-by-line reply to the CES letter, which is a very prominent kind of criticism of the church. And I read it, and he kept the guy who wrote it, a guy named Jeremy Runnels, kept saying no one's ever responded to this. And I had a blog at the time, and on my blog I had written all kinds of articles about the church, but also about other things that had nothing to do with the church. But as I read the CES letter, I started cutting and pasting parts of my blog in response. And then the deeper I got into it, the more I thought I really want to just sort of respond to this line by line. And so my response is essentially a book. It's 150,000 words long. It's 371 pages long. But I wrote that, I published it, and I've gotten a really great response from it. And it's given me the opportunity to talk to people in and out of the church and talk to people like you and your listeners about these kinds of issues.
Thank you so much for sharing that, Brother Bennett. And, you know, for in this channel, we cover criticisms of the church and many things that can be said both in favor and against. And we listen to all kinds of stories. But something that might not be very familiar on our side is the CS letter. No, I've
Mm-hmm.
read it and I've read your reply. Uh, but could you tell us a little bit more about what is the CS letter?
Well, CES stands for Church Educational System, and this thing got its title. There's a man named Jeremy Runnels who lives in American Fork, and was just an ordinary member of the church who experienced the faith crisis. He heard Elder Marlon K. Jensen talk about historical issues that were driving people out of the church. And Elder Jensen at that point said, we've never had a time of apostasy since Kirtland, like we're seeing right now over these issues. And Jeremy was very shocked by that and said, well, what are the issues? And so he went online and found a series of issues that have been troubling to people for decades, if not centuries. Problems with the Book of Mormon, problems with the Book of Abraham, problems with other kinds of church history and doctrine. And he brought them to his grandfather, who said to him, I have a friend who is a CES director, and why don't you just write up all of your problems and concerns for this CES director and give it to him? And Jeremy approached the CES director, and the CES director wrote back and said, this is very well written, and I'd be happy to give you a reply, and then never replied. And so Jeremy's faith crisis led him out of the church. He couldn't reconcile these issues. And he ended up resigning from the church during his disciplinary council. I mean, he was called, he published his CES letter, and he was called before a disciplinary council for it. And in the middle of it, he handed his resignation letter to his stake president and left the church. So the CES letter has, I think, had a wider reach than just about any other kind of church criticism. And in the age of the internet, it's been very helpful to people looking for sort of a one-stop shop gathering of all of the conventional criticisms against the church. And it does that in a fairly accessible, straightforward manner. In my experience, I was 18 years old and a student at the University of Southern California. And I read a book called The God Makers, which is kind of out of date at this point. But in the 1980s, it was sort of the CES letter of its day. It had all these criticisms of the church, and it talked about polygamy, and it talked about the temple, which I had not yet gone through when I read this book. And it talked about other things that were problematic in the church, and it really shook my faith. And later on, I was given a copy of a book called The Truth About the God Makers. It was written by a man named Gilbert W. Scharfs, who I had never heard of. I since had the opportunity to meet him and thank him for his book. But The Truth About the God Makers went line by line through the God Makers to point out what the problems were. And it wasn't that this book answered all of my questions and put all of my doubts to rest, so much as the book was able to calm me down. It was able to say, oh, okay, I don't have to leave the church today. There are smart, intelligent, decent people who have looked at these same issues, and they've somehow been able to come out with a testimony on the other side. Maybe I can too. And that was enough to give me the time and the patience to work through these issues in a way that was satisfying to me. So when I heard about the CES letter, I don't know exactly when, but I had a cousin who left the church as a result of it. And it was just kind of all over online. Oh, have you read the CES letter? The CES letter, it's gonna. And I went, okay, I don't feel like I have any choice but to read this CES letter. I want to see what's out there. And I read it, and I got God Makers flashbacks. It was like I was reading the God Makers at 18, except I was now in my 50s and late 40s at the time, I guess. And I had worked through a lot of these issues, and they weren't as shocking to me as they were when I first encountered them at 18. And I thought, okay, no, he's getting this wrong. Wait a minute, no. And so what I wanted to do was sort of pay Gilbert W. Scharfs forward, honor that legacy and go forward and do the kind of line by line response that Gilbert Scharf's had done for the God Makers. And so that's what I did. And I published it online on the 1st of April of 2016, which in retrospect, publishing something you want taken seriously on April Fool's Day isn't always a great idea. I got a lot of flack for that. But it's been a really positive experience. People have responded to it positively. And it's opened the door for me to have all kinds of conversations with people in and out of the church. One of the things that's been really interesting that I did not anticipate is that as I've talked to people, they've wanted me to sort of go and talk to people out of the church and get in debates with them and get in fights with them. And I said, I don't want to debate anybody. I don't want to fight anybody, but I'm happy to talk to anybody. And so I found myself talking to people that a lot of people in the church don't like. Talking to people like John DeLynn and Bill Reel, who are very outspoken critics of the church, both of whom have left the church. And after doing that, I started getting messages, not from people in the church, but from people out of the church who said, you didn't persuade me to come back to church, but you did help me understand my family and friends who have stayed. And I've been really touched by that and really moved by that, because I think that we have a real problem in the church with people who with the inability to maintain community and love with people who have lost their faith. And that becomes a problem in marriages when one spouse no longer believes and the other does. It becomes a problem in families when children no longer believe and their parents do, or vice versa. And I have spent most of my time in this space addressing that issue in the past few years, and less time sort of focusing on the hardline apologetics that are in the CES letter reply. So that's a very, very long answer to your question. So you feel free to edit.
No, thank you for that. And, I think that's something interesting about what you do is that, on one side, when we see replies or trying to cover the CS letter, we got things that, like this is a show or things like that, that maybe can be a bit too critical or a bit too antagonizing of both the critics and the criticisms. But I like something that you said in other interviews, that your focus and your reply is not really attacking people who believe Jeremy, but the argument itself. Is that correct?
That is correct. You mentioned this is the show. They quoted me extensively in that show. And that show was very sarcastic and very biting and very cutting, and I was embarrassed by it. I was embarrassed not just because I didn't like their approach, but I was embarrassed that my letter could be used that way, that people could interpret my letter as being equally snarky. It made me want to repent of some of the things that I had said in my reply that were unkind. And what's interesting is that I have since had an opportunity to talk to the people who did This Is the Show. That's the Midnight Mormons group. And they actually flew me down to California where they taped their shows. And I spent a weekend with them, and I've since talked to them several other times, and I consider them friends. I have also had the opportunity to meet and talk to Jeremy Runnels, who wrote the CES letter. He saw me on a podcast and wrote me a nasty email, and I wrote a nasty email back. And finally I said, wouldn't this be more fun over burgers? I'm buying. And so I took him to lunch, and we had a magnificent, fun lunch. We talked for about 3 hours or so. And we could have talked longer if we'd had more time. And we've since talked a number of different times. I've seen him several times since that lunch, and I consider Jeremy a friend. So I don't think it is necessary or even desirable to attack people or to demonize people. The fact that Jeremy Runnels has made arguments that I think are very weak arguments against the church, actually, that don't hold up to scrutiny, does not mean I think that Jeremy Runnels is a bad person. Quite the opposite. I think Jeremy Runnels is a good person. And I see many good people who go through faith crisis, who don't have the tools to deal with it, either the tools to stay or the tools to navigate a new life if they decide to leave. And I really want to be in a space where I can help provide those kinds of tools to people on both sides of the divide.
Perfect, brother. Thank you for clarifying that. And as we delve into these topics, I think it was important to clarify this. I think that sometimes, or maybe on my end, I've seen it many times, there can be maybe young men or even missionaries who read these documents with debunking in mind. So I think it's better to take a look at these topics as for better understanding, rather than having this debate debunking approach.
Well, no, I think that's true. I get a lot of messages from missionaries because they found my reply helpful, because the CES letter has had such a pervasive reach, particularly in the United States. I don't know if it's gotten down. I know that there is now a Spanish translation that's may have made its way down to Mexico City. There isn't a Spanish translation of my reply, unfortunately. I've had several people ask me if I'd be interested in producing one, and my answer is yes, I would love to, except I don't speak Spanish. I'd have to hire somebody to do it, and I don't make any money off of this. I don't really have the resources to do that. But missionaries are many of the people who've read it. I've had some mission presidents assign all of the missionaries in their mission to read my CES letter reply. And I find that very humbling. I've really been grateful for that it's been useful and helpful to so many people.
Perfect. Thank you. And, without further ado, I think that many of us are listening to the story and can see where you're coming from. So I think we're pretty interested in what you actually say in your reply. So you've had interviews, like you said, with John Dehlin and many other people. And, I was just checking those interviews, and some are over 10 hours long. So we might not be able to cover all the topics of the letter in here. But I think we could cover the three main topics that I've seen have pop up as issues in here in Mexico. And so the first one is what's considered the keystone of our religion, the Book of Mormon. Why don't we start that? Could you tell us what the CES letter says about the Book of Mormon and what's in your reply?
Sure. The CES letter spends a great deal of time right at the outset attacking the Book of Mormon, and it does so from a variety of angles. It cites all of these different theories of where the Book of Mormon came from. It talks about View of the Hebrews, which was an 1820s essay that talked about the theory that Native Americans were descended from the lost 10 tribes of Israel. And Fawn Brody, who wrote a critical biography of Joseph Smith called No Man Knows My History, talked about View of the Hebrews as being one of the sources that Joseph Smith used to write the Book of Mormon. But Jeremy isn't content to stop with the View of the Hebrews. He cites all these other different books or different things that are possible sources for the Book of Mormon. He cites a book called The Late War of Napoleon against the United States or something like that. There was a school book that told the story of the War of 1812. No, I'm conflating two books. One is called The Late War, that talks about the War of 1812, and then there's another book called The Book of Napoleon that talks about Napoleon, because Napoleon wasn't involved in the War of 1812. And both of them are written in King James English, much just as the Book of Mormon is. So they use phrases, biblical phrases, that sound very much like the Book of Mormon. And so Jeremy says, okay, well, Joseph Smith stole the Book of Mormon from the view of the Hebrews, and he also stole the Book of Mormon from the Late War, and he stole it from the Book of Napoleon, and he also stole it from a bunch of place names that were on maps that were around him. He takes this map and says, these are all names stolen from the Book of Mormon, and there are a handful of names, and very few of them are even similar to Book of Mormon names. But my response to that is the fact that you have so many different and conflicting arguments as to where the Book of Mormon came from weakens each of them individually. Because if the Book of Mormon were definitively something that was plagiarized from view of the Hebrews, then you wouldn't have to go looking at the Late War or the Book of Napoleon as different source materials. The fact is, you don't have a coherent argument for where the Book of Mormon came from. And he spends most of his time, and then he gets into sort of very specific problems he has with Book of Mormon translations that demonstrate that he doesn't understand how translation works. He gets mad that there are words in the Bible that it's a really weak argument, and anybody's happy to. I could get into it, but explaining the particulars of it is kind of exhausting. The point being, he fires everything he has at the Book of Mormon, and he's firing in conflicting directions. And his arguments contradict each other, and he doesn't seem to care just so long as people lose their faith in the Book of Mormon. He doesn't care how he gets there. He doesn't care if the argument is intellectually consistent, and which it isn't. And one of the things that I found so frustrating about Jeremy's letter is that so often he will cite a source when it's very clear he hasn't actually read the source and doesn't know what the source says. That's particularly true when he cites the view of the Hebrews, which is the most popular possible source material for the Book of Mormon, because it's been referenced by many critics for a great many years. But people pass along that argument without actually examining it for themselves and realizing that it falls apart. If you spend 5 minutes reading the book of the Hebrews, I had to read the whole thing, or I felt like I had to read the whole thing, so I did. But if you spend 5 minutes with it, you can tell that it has nothing to do with the Book of Mormon. It's not a story. It's an essay. It makes arguments that don't appear in the Book of Mormon. None of its arguments appear in the Book of Mormon. The only thing it has in common with the Book of Mormon is that both the Book of Mormon and View of the Hebrews believe that Native Americans were Israelite in origin. And that's it. And there's nothing else. There's no story. There's no events. There's no anything in View of the Hebrews that makes its way into the Book of Mormon. It's written in an entirely different style. It isn't written in the same kind of King James English that the Book of Mormon is written in. It's just a flimsy argument. And that's the thing that you keep finding when you read the CES letter, is that all of these arguments look really damning at first glance, until you spend any time actually looking at the source materials and discover that either Jeremy doesn't understand what he's saying, or he hasn't read what he's saying, and it just it sort of breaks my heart that people leave the church because they've been given bad information. And when I say bad information, I mean, Jeremy keeps saying, well, you're calling me a liar. I'm not calling Jeremy a liar by any means. I'm saying that this is bad scholarship, that Jeremy is taking arguments that he hasn't examined for himself, and he believes the arguments as he passes them along, but the arguments are weak. There's nothing to them. And that's particularly the case with the arguments against the Book of Mormon. The case for the Book of Mormon, the positive case for the Book of Mormon, is much, much stronger than I think even most members of the church realize. Certainly much stronger than most critics are willing to admit. And you see that in the CES letter, as Jeremy fires all of these guns against the Book of Mormon, and ends up shooting himself in the foot because his arguments contradict each other and demonstrate that no one is able to replicate or explain where the Book of Mormon came from. Just one quick story at the end of this. My father wrote a book about the origins of the Book of Mormon. It was called Leap of Faith, and the subtitle was Confronting the Origins of the Book of Mormon. And near the end of his life, he suffered from pancreatic cancer. And right near the end of his life, he was asked to give a fireside about the Book of Mormon and about his book. And he did. This was on April 10th of 2016. He gave this fireside. The next day, he suffered a debilitating stroke, and we all rushed to his bedside, and 3 weeks later, he had passed away. So this fireside was essentially the last thing my father ever said publicly on any subject, and he was talking about the Book of Mormon. And what he said was, the thing about the Book of Mormon is that somebody wrote it. And he says, which makes it difficult to dismiss, because in order to dismiss the Book of Mormon, you have to explain who wrote it. And none of the explanations that are offered by people like Jeremy Runnels, that are offered by critics of the church, make any sense at all. And most of them require a belief in miracles every bit as miraculous as gold plates and an angel. The idea that Joseph Smith could have just sat down and made this up, just pulled it out of his hat, as you will. People talk about the rock and the hat. Jeremy's really focused on that. But it doesn't work. It doesn't hold up to scrutiny. And so I really think that if anybody is struggling with their faith, the best way to address that is to dive as deeply into the Book of Mormon as you possibly can, because that, I think, is the divine access point that the Lord has used in the restoration to bring people to him. And that's the reason why I have confidence in the future of the church. I have confidence in the power of the restoration, because the Book of Mormon, people who encounter the Book of Mormon encounter God in its pages. And no degree of criticism can keep that from happening.
Yeah, before we move on to our next topic, I just wanted to ask you one question. I don't know if we might spend too much talking about this, but I was reading the first time I read the CES letter was around 2017. And back then, I haven't read the new edition. I don't know if it has changed. But as you mentioned, it focuses on plagiarism claims, and it mentions View of the Hebrews, the Late War. And first, I noticed that the criticism was he plagiarized, like he used those books as sources. But then I've seen that the narrative has changed in this past few years, and it's no longer about he plagiarized books, but rather these books show that people in that time period believed that Native Americans were Israelites, and that shows that Joseph, while he maybe didn't necessarily plagiarize from those books, was just a product of its time. What do you think about that?
I think you're right that that's where the argument has gone, because if there were any evidence of actual plagiarism, the Book of Mormon would be done. I mean, if you're able to find some other book that, I mean, this is what the early critics of the church used to do with what was called the Spalding theory. The idea was that Solomon Spalding, a novelist, had written a book that Joseph Smith had simply copied. Solomon Spalding was dead by the time the Book of Mormon was published, and somehow Joseph Smith got his hands on this book, copied it, called it the Book of Mormon, took credit for it. And that was the prevailing theory for the Book of Mormon's origins for 50 years at least, until 1890 something, when a copy of Solomon Spalding's book showed up and ruined everything because it bears no resemblance to the Book of Mormon. It doesn't even talk about Israelites. It talks about a group of Romans who come and they end up in America and they end up having love affairs and all kinds of things that are just nothing at all like the Book of Mormon. And even the fiercest critics of the Book of Mormon now acknowledge that the Spalding theory is nonsense. But okay, so you don't have plagiarism. There's no evidence of plagiarism. So you retreat to this idea that, okay, well, Joseph is a product of his time, and this idea of Native Americans as Israelites was in the air, right? It was part of the zeitgeist. It was just everywhere to be found. That doesn't tell me anything about the production of the Book of Mormon. Okay, for instance, there are a lot of people who are interested in World War II. There are a lot of books about World War II. A lot of them take different approaches to World War II and have different, I mean, all of them do. To say that somebody else wrote a book about World War II, then therefore anybody who writes a book after that is somehow plagiarizing the previous book, is really where we find ourselves. It's a really kind of silly argument. And it's even different because World War II is a set of facts upon which most people agree. And even that, you can have all kinds of different books and different approaches to those facts. But the Book of Mormon, you have this broad theme, and how Joseph approaches it is different from how anybody else approached it. It's different from how View of the Hebrews approached it. It's different from how parodies of the Book of Mormon. There was a book called the Book of Pukey that was written to make fun of the Book of Mormon and really bears no resemblance to the Book of Mormon at all either. Hugh Nibley, great Latter-day Saint scholar, said it's akin to saying, draw me a circle and I will make you a Swiss watch. You know, everybody said, look, Joseph Smith could draw a circle, and we've seen other people that can draw a circle. So that's how he made a Swiss watch. I mean, the amount of complexity, the amount of, internal consistency, theological arguments, of all kinds of things that are in the Book of Mormon. They require some serious scholarship and some serious skill that Joseph Smith did not have, and that his critics all of the time insisted he did not have. But just because he, if I start talking to you, and this is a better analogy, I am a guy who believes that William Shakespeare was a pseudonym, that the guy who is attributed, who is given credit for writing all of the plays of Shakespeare, who had a name similar to William Shakespeare, is not actually the guy who wrote the plays. I believe that William Shakespeare is a name like Mark Twain that belonged to somebody else. And there has been over a century of people that have tried to determine who William Shakespeare really was. Now, I don't even know if you've ever heard of this before, the Shakespeare authorship question. But for me to tell you that there is a Shakespeare authorship question and people have different ideas about who Shakespeare really was. If you, Gustavo, were to take that, would you feel equipped right now to write a lengthy book about any of it? I mean, you would have to go do some more research on your own. You'd have to go get your own point of view. You'd have to do all kinds of work and labor and scholarship to flesh that out beyond the broad theme that I've given you at the outset. And all of the supposed source materials for the Book of Mormon don't give Joseph Smith anything broader than that one broad theme. Gives him this one idea. Joseph then has to go write, 260 something thousand words of a coherent narrative covering 1,600 years of history, set in a geography that is internally consistent, written with reference to Semitic ideas that Joseph would not have had access to in 1830. I mean, it just becomes really silly, and people downgrading from plagiarism to, oh, well, he got the idea from these other books. People don't recognize what a huge downgrade that is. It's just not a credible argument that explains anything about the Book of Mormon.
Gracias por ver esta primera parte y si les gustó pueden comentar, compartir, suscribirse y esperen pronto la segunda parte.